Hello, this is Ernesto Amaral from the Department of Sociology at Texas A&M University. In this lecture, I'm going to be talking about global reorderings, which is based on Chapter 7 of the textbook by McMichael and Weber. This is a lecture of our social change class, and as I mentioned before, you should read the chapter of the textbook to be able to complete the quizzes, because some of the specific examples that are available in the chapter, I'm not going to talk here in the lecture. And at the same time, you should read or watch the lecture, so you should be able to complete the perusal assignments part of our course. So chapter 7 is divided on these main topics here: globalization project legacies, special economic zones, global production networks, multipolarity, nascent development trajectories, the Chinese model, economic nationalism, the fourth industrial revolution, and green transition. So starting here on globalization project legacies, the globalization project deepened inequalities between and within countries across the world, as we have been talking throughout this course. Market liberalization prioritized global capital over national development strategies and welfare. So the priority was much more about profiting of these big corporations instead of actual national development, which increased inequality around the world. Structural reforms led to precarious employment and reduced public services. Legacy of debt dependency continues to constrain development policy in the Global South. So a lot of the issues that the Global South experience nowadays is related to the globalization project, all of these legacies that it has been having throughout all this time, all these decades. And it's important to notice that the globalization project has been having major effects on social change around the world. In terms of global power dynamics have shifted significantly since the height of the neoliberal globalization. New geopolitical and economic arrangements are emerging in response to global crises. These global reorderings reflect tensions between market integration and national sovereignty. And these special economic zones, they are geographic areas with deregulated labor and trade to attract foreign investment. So throughout all these changes that are going on in the world, these zones, they try to deregulate labor in order to have more investment from other countries. They promote export-oriented growth by offering tax breaks and relaxed regulations. Workers in the SEZs face poor conditions, low wages, and limited labor rights. The special economic zones, they deepen global hierarchies by locking regions into subordinate production roles. So usually like countries in the Global South, they are dependent on all this investment from countries in the Global North. So it keeps emphasizing these hierarchies among countries. Global production networks, they organize global supply chains across borders under the control of transnational firms. Labor and resources are sourced from multiple countries to reduce costs and maximize profits. This fragmentation of production reduces national control over development strategies. The GPNs rely on just-in-time logistics, making them vulnerable to geopolitical disruptions, as we just discussed in the previous chapters. Decline of neoliberal consensus. That's a major thing that's being debated right now across the world. The 2008 financial crisis and rising inequality exposed flaws in neoliberal policies. Public discontent with austerity and elite governance has grown globally. Neoliberalism no longer holds uncontested legitimacy as a global policy framework. So you start to doubt this, the way that the world is organized, which leads to the possibilities of social change all over the world. So crisis as a catalyst for reordering. Crisis in this globalization project often open political and social space for rethinking priorities. Moments of disruption can shift public discourse and institutional direction. The COVID-19 pandemic exposed systematic vulnerabilities and sparked demands for change, as we also discussed in the previous chapter. So you have some possibilities in global reordering. Global reorderings present challenges and openings for transformation. Emergent alternatives call for equity, sustainability, and democratic control. The future of development lies in collective action and imaginative possibility. So you start to have all these possibilities of global reordering, and this debate, these emergent alternatives, they are usually emphasized by countries in the global south. So you have rethinking sovereignty. Sovereignty is increasingly understood as relational rather than absolute. Nations must navigate interdependence while protecting local interests. Sovereignty now includes responsibilities to both people and planet, and also related to the topic of climate change that we have been addressing throughout the course. And there are some lessons from this crisis in the globalization project. Global crises, they review the fragility of current systems and assumptions. They also provide opportunities for learning, solidarity, and transformation. These crises, they can catalyze new practices and relationships for a better world. And the topic of multipolarity, it starts to come up in a much stronger way throughout the world. The global power structure is shifting from US hegemony towards multipolarity. Emerging powers like China, India, and Brazil are asserting influence in global governance. Institutions like BRICS and the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank reflect this shift. Multipolarity challenges Western dominance in shaping global economic policies. So the rise of this multipolarity, the global power is increasingly distributed among multiple state and regional actors. Countries like China, India, and Brazil challenge this Western economic dominance. Multipolarity reflects new alignments in trade, investments, and diplomacy. So all this debate right now about international trade and tariffs, it's really related to all this realignment that is starting to see among countries that challenge the Western economic dominance, that challenge the United States economic dominance, and also challenge the Western Europe dominance. Global South has been reclaiming sovereignty. Countries in the Global South are asserting economic and political independence. Efforts include regional trade agreements and resistance to the International Monetary Fund style conditionality. So all those different loans that countries in the Global South, they relied from the IMF, the problem with those loans is that the IMF requested a lot of austerity measures in countries in the Global South. So the Global South countries, they start to realign among themselves, and which is a resistance to all these austerity conditions implemented or imposed by IMF whenever they provided loans to those countries. This shift reflects long-standing demands for decolonization and self-determination of countries in the Global South. So we start to see all these economic realignments. Nations in the Global South are fostering new economic ties outside traditional Western networks. South-South cooperation is growing through trade, infrastructure, and financial partnerships. The shifts reflect a desire for autonomy and multipolar engagement in global affairs. Regional integration projects, they start to happen all over the world. Initiatives like Mercosur, like countries in South America and the African continental free trade area, they are expanding. Regional cooperation is seen as a way to build economic and political resilience. These projects balance local autonomy with global engagement. So just to emphasize, the BRICS represents a challenge to Western hegemony. And BRICS originally was funded by Brazil, Russia, India, and China. And then afterwards, right after it started with South Africa. But now many other countries are joining this BRICS alliance. This coalition advocates for a more balanced global order and development financing. BRICS has proposed new institutions like the New Development Bank. And the New Development Bank has been a major topic all over the world because it's talking about other ways to provide loans to developing countries, and it challenges the dominance of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. And on the second part of the chapter, on nascent development trajectories. New development paths are emerging in reaction to neoliberal globalization's failures. These trajectories prioritize national control, regional alliances, and social protection. Some states, they focus on domestic industrialization and food sovereignty. Development is being redefined to include environmental and social sustainability. So there is a shift in development paradigms. The crisis of legitimacy in mainstream development has sparked new paradigms. Development now integrates cultural identity, environmental stewardship, and local knowledge. Plural approaches, they challenge the one-size-fits-all model of Western modernization. So you start to have a shift in how development is supposed to happen all over the world. And mostly this challenge being brought by countries in the Global South. Multilateral institutions, they face crises of legitimacy and effectiveness, such as the IMF and the World Bank. Global challenges, they require cooperation, but governance is often fragmented. Reforming institutions is crucial for addressing shared problems. So you have a crisis of multilateralism. Multilateral institutions, they face declining trust and effectiveness in resolving global challenges. So examples of these multilateral institutions, exactly the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. Geopolitical rivalries and unilateral actions, they undermine cooperative problem solving. Reimagining global governance is necessary for inclusive and coordinated responses. And you have, in relation to that, a lot of migration in here, emphasizing a lot of international migration and global tensions. International migration, people moving from one country to another. Mass migration has intensified due to conflict, climate change, and economic instability. Receiving nations have imposed stricter immigration controls and securitarized borders. And that's really the case now, what's going on in the US with this increasing in border security in the southern border of the US. But it also happens in Europe, and it's also happened in several countries around the world. Migration remains a flashpoint in global political and ethical debates, as we also debated in the previous chapter. And related to these nascent development trajectories is the Chinese model. China's development combines state-led planning with global market integration. Investment in infrastructure and manufacturing enable rapid industrialization and poverty reduction in China. And the Belt and Road Initiative expands China's geopolitical and economic influence globally. So the Chinese model has this strong state-led planning in their economy, but at the same time, they try to integrate globally. And their Belt and Road Initiative is exactly related to that. Critics argue the model reproduces dependency and environmental degradation in other regions. So you have also critics related to the Chinese model. In the China's global role, China has become a central actor in global economic development. And the Belt and Road Initiative expands the Chinese influence through infrastructure investment. So other countries start to be dependent on China to develop the infrastructure. China promotes alternatives to Western-led institutions like exactly the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. And you start to have economic nationalism. States are reasserting sovereignty over economic policy and resource management. Protectionist measures, they challenge the neoliberal principle of open markets. Economic nationalism includes tariffs, reshoring industries, and local content requirements. This trend reflects disillusionment with globalization's uneven outcomes. And you have resurgent nationalism. Globalization backlash has fueled nationalist movements in many countries. Nationalism often emphasizes border control, cultural identity, and economic protectionism. So exactly because of the globalization crisis, the crisis of this neoliberal order of economy, you start to have this pushback of nationalism with a nationalist ideology, and that has a lot to do with these authoritarian governments that we have been having all over the world, emphasizing border control, which is exactly what's going on here in the US in the southern border, emphasizes the anti-immigration feelings because related to cultural identity, and economic protectionism, which is really related to all this debate about tariffs internationally. These trends, they challenge global cooperation and liberal democratic norms. So because of the crisis of neoliberal order, because of the crisis of globalization, you have this nationalist pushback, and actually also you start to have a lot of these authoritarian governments pushing back against democracy. Although they say that they are pro-democracy, a lot of their actions are anti-democratic. So you have populism and legitimacy crisis. Populist leaders, they gain support by criticizing elites in globalization. They often promote authoritarian governance and social polarization. Populism reflects widespread dissatisfaction with neoliberal globalization outcomes. So this is exactly what's going on right now in the US and in Western European countries as well. And related to that, we have the fourth industrial revolution, the 4IR. Refers to the fusion of digital, biological, and physical technologies, including artificial intelligence, robotics, and biotechnology. Unlike previous industrial revolutions, it blurs boundaries across sectors and disciplines. It accelerates automation, reshaping labor markets, and deepening job insecurity. It raises ethical concerns about surveillance, data privacy, and unequal access to technological advances. So you have a lot of automation going on in these countries right now. There are some challenges of the fourth industrial revolution. The fourth industrial revolution integrates AI, robotics, and biotechnology in production, as we just mentioned. It threatens traditional labor markets through automation and job displacement. Wealth may further concentrate in countries, leading to technological innovation. So it might increase even more inequality between countries. Ethical and regulatory challenges arise as technology advances ethical and regulatory challenges arise as technology advances faster than governance. And you have also technological competitions. Nations that compete over control of digital infrastructure and artificial intelligence. Technological advancements, they raise ethical concerns about surveillance and data use. Digital power has become a key dimension of geopolitical influence. It may intensify global inequalities as wealthy nations and corporations, they dominate innovation and data control. There are calls for new governance frameworks to ensure equitable and sustainable outcomes. And in terms of automation, this figure here in our course textbook showing the industrial robots for 10,000 manufacturing workers in 2021. You see, for example, in Korea, Singapore, Japan, really high levels of automation. Right, industrial robots in Korea, 1,000 per 10,000 manufacturing workers. In Singapore, almost 700 for every 10,000 manufacturing workers. In France, Spain, much lower. And this is part of this article by Robert Atkinson. The Chinese manufacturers use 12 times more robots than US manufacturers when controlling for wages. So it's good to check out this article here too. But you see that exactly in Japan, Singapore, and Korea, this automation happening much stronger pace than, for example, in the US. And this difference here between US and China might not look so big, but when you control for wages, the automation is much higher in China than in US. And you also have this green transition. Climate change pressures are prompting investment in green infrastructure and energy. Transitioning to renewables is a key aspect of future development strategies. Green growth promises ecological sustainability, but risks replicating inequalities. A just transition requires addressing both environmental and social dimensions of change. So all these social changes that are going on in the world related to the crisis of the globalization project requires addressing climate change issues, requires addressing these environmental dimensions, as well as social dimensions, as well as the dimension of inequality that has been increasing all over the world. So you have climate politics and global division. Climate change requires global cooperation, but reveals deep divisions. Developed and developing nations, they disagree on responsibility and financing of development of all these different countries. Climate politics, they reflect broader struggles over justice and equity, because dealing with the issues of climate change require investment in order to have development. And then you have all these tensions as well between developed and developing countries. And there are a lot of interconnected crises going on, as we have been talking throughout this course. The current global crisis related to climate, finance, and migration crisis, they are deeply interrelated. These interconnected challenges highlight the failure of fragmented solutions. Holistic approaches are needed to address the root causes of global disorder. And then you have some alternatives to globalization. New development models, they emphasize local autonomy and social inclusion. Solidarity, economies, and community-based initiatives, they challenge neoliberal norms. These alternatives seek to balance economic viability with social and ecological sustainability. And the topic of democratic accountability is important here as well. Citizens that demand transparency, participation, and accountability from institutions. Social audits, civic tech, and participatory budgeting promotes democratic renewal. Democratization is key to building inclusive and resilient societies. And in terms of repoliticizing the economy, there is growing recognition that markets are shaped by political choices. Movements demand economic systems that serve public interest and planetary limits. So all these social movements that demand these changes, they influence social change all over the world. Repoliticizing economics makes space for democratic control over key decisions. So the economy is not thought as something outside. It is free market that should be led by itself in a neoliberal framework. We have political choices that we can make over them, and social movements are really important within this debate. There is an emphasis on the public sector. Global disruptions have renewed interest in public institutions and infrastructure. Public health, education, and social protection are seen as essential investments. The pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, highlighted the limitations of privatized and fragmented systems, emphasized the need of a strong public sector, and in this case, to exactly provide public health services in a more efficient way. And you have these post-growth movements. Critics of endless growth call for downscaling production and consumption. Degrowth prioritizes well-being, equity, and ecological balance. As discussed before, post-growth frameworks, they challenge the gross domestic product as the sole measure of development. You have transition to just futures is in the debate right now. Calls are growing for systematic change that centers justice and sustainability. Transitions require rethinking power, economics, and relationships to nature. Movements around the world are shaping post-globalization trajectories. So these social movements are really important to influence social change all over the globe. And there are plural pathways to development. There is no single pathway to development. There is no single neoliberal model to development. Pluralism honors culture and contextual diversity. Diverse pathways reflect different values, goals, and forms of progress. Recognition of pluralism supports coexistence and mutual respect. There are cultural shifts and narratives. Dominant narratives of development are being contested and reimagined, as it's discussed in the textbook. Cultural movements promote pluralism, dignity, and collective identities. Reframing development stories help build more inclusive global futures. And reimagine the social contract. Social contracts are being rethought in light of inequality and exclusion. There's a call to redefine rights, responsibilities, and resource sharing. Reimagined contracts emphasize justice, participation, and ecological balance. And you have the role of civil society as well. The civil society organizations, they advocate for human rights, accountability, and social justice. They often bridge grassroots concerns with global forums and decision makers. The CSOs, they contribute to democratic renewal and challenge authoritarian tendencies. So you start to have this building from the ground up. Bottom-up initiatives, they prioritize community needs, voices, and leaderships, instead of coming from central institutions in the global north being pushed to the global south. You have the other way around, the bottom-up initiatives coming from community needs. Such approaches, they build local capacity and promote inclusive governance. They are key to resilient and context-appropriate development models. You have now localized adaptation. Communities are developing context-specific solutions to global problems. Local knowledge and innovation are essential for resilience and sustainability. Adaptation strategies, they include agroecology, cooperative economies, and participatory governance. And you have resistance to extractivism. Communities are mobilizing against large-scale resource extraction projects. These struggles defend land rights, biodiversity, and local livelihoods. So you have much more participation of the civil society. Anti-extractivist movements challenge the exploitative logic of global capitalism. You have on the topic of food sovereignty and localism. Food sovereignty emphasizes control over local food systems and resources. That has been happening a lot in several countries in the global south, such as in Brazil, for example. In Brazil, you still have the big corporations in agriculture, but you also have a lot of policies influencing the development of local agriculture, of family agriculture. So you start to have food sovereignty in the center of the debate of global south countries for their development. Movement supports smallholder farmers, so family agriculture, agroecology, and biodiversity. Localism resists global agribusiness and promotes sustainable practices. But they work also they don't take out agribusinesses of these countries. They emphasize smallholder farmers while agribusiness still produce a lot of resources in agriculture as well. There is transformative education. Education is key to building critical awareness and global solidarity. Transformative education emphasizes dialogue, diversity, and civic engagement. It fosters informed participation in shaping equitable and sustainable futures. And in terms of the role of youth in global change, youth movements are at the forefront of social and environmental activism. Young people are redefining global citizenship through digital and grassroots organizing. They emphasize intersectionality, climate change, and participatory democracy. So overall, what we discussed in this chapter, we explored shifting global power and post-neoliberal alternatives. It highlighted resistance movements and South-South cooperation, emphasized ethics of care, justice, and plural development pathways. It stressed crises as opportunities for systematic rethinking, outlined new visions for democratic, sustainable, and equitable futures. And the South-South cooperation is a major topic that we discussed here in this chapter. And here are some questions for reflection that are useful for you to also complete the assignments of this course. How are global crises reshaping traditional development models? What alternatives to neoliberal globalization are gaining traction? How do ethics of care and interdependence challenge dominant frameworks? What role does civil society play in reimagining global futures? And how can plural pathways promote more just and sustainable development? So thank you very much. This was another lecture on our social change class. Thank you very much for your attention.